Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to introduce our paper, Exploring Experience Gaps Between Active and Passive Users During Multi-User Locomotion in VR. Now, VR multi-user locomotion is becoming increasingly common. Among them, co-locomotion is an important form, where one user controls the locomotion of other users as a navigator or driver, referred to as the active user, while the passengers being controlled are referred to as passive users. Co-locomotion has two benefits. On one hand, transferring the control of locomotion to others helps passive users save time and physical energy spent on navigation, allowing them to focus more on other interactive tasks. On the other hand, active participants, such as tour guides or experience sharers, can eliminate the cost of coordinating routes and checking for stragglers. However, such co-locomotion may result in experience gaps between active and passive users due to differences in movement intentions, different predictability of movements, and inconsistent multi-sensory motion cues caused by the active user's navigation methods and the passive user's behavior. To address the aforementioned challenges, we are interested in systematically exploring the experience gaps between active and passive users under different locomotion conditions or sub-locomotion, as well as the impact of various factors on these gaps. Before conducting formal experiments, we first screened and defined typical locomotion methods for active users and behaviors for passive users, which will be combined as conditions for the formal experiments. For example, walking, which represents continuous embodied locomotion, flying joystick, which represents continuous artificial locomotion, teleportation, which represents discrete locomotion for active users, and the two basic actions of standing still and looking around for passive users. Furthermore, we selected 11 and 3 typical sub-locomotion types from locomotion situations of active users and passive users. Factors such as susceptibility to motion sickness, locomotion speed, teleportation intervals, and duration of locomotion are often considered to affect the sensory conflict. Therefore, based on the susceptibility scores of active and passive users on the motion sickness susceptibility scale, we divided the active and passive users into 4 groups: prone to dizziness and prone to dizziness, prone to dizziness and not prone to dizziness, not prone to dizziness and prone to dizziness, not prone to dizziness and not prone to dizziness. To evaluate the impact of different combinations of locomotion parameters on experience gaps, we established 2 values, one large and one small, for the speed or teleportation interval of each sublocomotion as the formal experimental parameters. The locomotion parameters were determined through a pilot experiment. The process of the pilot experiment involved selecting 3 pairs of speed/teleportation interval from common settings of locomotion parameters found in relevant literature. Then, 8 participants individually experienced each set of motion parameters and selected the ones they believed were suitable for the co-locomotion scenario, as indicated by the numbers in blue parentheses. Finally, the speed and interval that were selected the most were determined as the locomotion parameters for each sublocomotion in the formal experiment. Based on the common locomotion behaviors of active users and passive participants discussed earlier, a total of 3 times 2 is equal to 6 conditions were designed: active user walking, passive user standing still, active user walking, passive user looking around, active user flying by joystick, passive user standing still, active user flying by joystick, passive user looking around, active user teleporting, passive user standing still, active user teleporting, passive user looking around. To evaluate the temporary experience gaps between active and passive users, we created a set of locomotion nodes for each case by combining sublocomotion types and locomotion parameters. The number of locomotion nodes for WS, WL, FS, FL, TS, and TL was 6, 24, 12, 48, 4, and 16 respectively. We selected a city scene with rich visual references as the experimental environment. To assist participants in achieving the required locomotion parameters for walking, teleportation, and head turning, we used guiding objects. For walking and looking around, we set up a semi-transparent sphere as a guide object to provide visual stimuli without obstructing the background behind it. This guide object guides participants in translation or rotation based on the direction and speed required by the locomotion nodes. For teleportation, we used red line segments and a countdown to guide the teleportation direction and the required teleportation interval. Active users use the joystick and buttons on the controller for 3 degrees of freedom translation and 3 degrees of freedom rotation. They also use the controller to project a parabolic ray for teleportation and control the teleportation direction by manipulating the joystick's offset direction. Passive users, on the other hand, perform a repetitive action of looking around. Participants are required to follow a guiding object by first turning their heads to one side and then turning their heads to the opposite side until the motion sequence ends. To ensure participant comfort during head turning, we set the turning points for the guiding object's repetitive locomotion based on the typical range of locomotion of the human neck. To balance the number of locomotion nodes under different conditions, we expanded the number of locomotion nodes for each condition to 48, which is the least common multiple of the number of nodes under all conditions. The duration of each locomotion node is 8 seconds. This experiment consists of 2 stages. In the initial stage, 24 active users completed all locomotion nodes under balanced order across conditions and recorded their locomotion data, including condition sequences, node sequences, and trajectories. In the second stage, 24 passive users performed the same locomotion nodes in the same order as their corresponding active users, and the locomotion trajectories of their paired active users were applied to them. After each locomotion node, participants need to fill out 5 single-item scales for temporary experience, including physiological comfort, psychological comfort, presence, locomotion sensation, and acceptability. Then, participants' view is reset to the origin and they enter the next locomotion node. After completing all locomotion nodes, participants need to fill out SSQ, presence scale, and custom questionnaires about psychological comfort, locomotion sensation, and acceptability. In comparing active and passive users under different conditions, there were significant differences in at least one experiential indicator for all conditions. Results from Wilcox and Signed-Rank tests showed significant differences between active and passive users in all experiential indicators when active users were flying with the control stick while passive users were stationary. Significant differences were only observed in the sense of presence when active users were teleporting and passive users were stationary. In the 2 conditions involving active users walking, the active users experience multisensory consistency, while passive users encounter conflicts between visual motion during stillness and perceived vestibular motion, further leading to mismatches between visual and vestibular perceptions of motion direction during looking around. Surprisingly, in the conditions involving active users walking and passive users looking around, these sensory conflicts did not result in significant differences in the locomotion sensation between active and passive users. This may be attributed to the alternating stepping of active users, causing left/right swaying and slight shaking of the view, which could induce a sensation of walking for passive users. In the 2 conditions involving active users flying using a joystick, we speculate that the prevalence of locomotion nodes related to turning results in significant differences in many metrics compared to other conditions. Additionally, changes in flying height may induce psychological discomfort in passive users due to a lack of locomotion control, leading to feelings of fear and excitement. In TS, passive users experience a similar sensation to watching an automatic slideshow presentation, while in TL, the teleportation by active users disrupts the rhythm of passive users' continuous observation of the environment. In terms of comparing the experience gaps between different conditions, the greatest gaps are observed in terms of motion sickness and psychological comfort between active users flying with a joystick and passive users looking around, as well as between active users flying with a joystick and passive users standing still. Regarding acceptability, most active users find the locomotion acceptable in all conditions, but more than half of the passive users cannot accept active users walking and passive users looking around. The conditions involving active users flying with a joystick and active users teleporting and passive users looking around. This table shows the significance results of the Wilcoxon test and the median of temporary experience gaps. We found that a large number of sub-locomotion combinations resulted in significant differences between active and passive users in terms of temporary experience gaps in terms of psychological and physiological comfort. In condition FL, numerous sub-locomotion combinations showed significant differences for both active and passive users. Second, we found that the turning behavior of active users usually leads to significant experience gaps between active and passive users, especially during rolling. We speculate that rotations generate a greater vestibular visual conflict compared to translations. The increased prominence of roll rotation is due to the relatively low frequency of experiencing rolling rotations in daily life, further exacerbating physiological responses to this novel and unusual stimulation of sensory conflict. Third, when active users turn body and passive users look around, most indicators show significant differences. We speculate that when the rotation axis of the active user aligns with the passive user's axis of head turning, the passive user perceives visual motion at double the speed when both rotate in the same direction or cancels out visual motion when both rotate in opposite directions, similar to applying dynamic visual redirection with rotational gains. When the active and passive users rotate along different axes, the passive user perceives a composite rotation of the two axes visually, conflicting with the vestibular perception of rotation along only one axis, resulting in sensory conflict and exacerbating physiological discomfort. Interestingly, when active users translate and passive users turn heads in a similar direction, some passive users may even score higher in terms of presence and locomotion sensation than active users. We speculate that the head movements involving rotation around the neck not only include rotation but also follow an arc-shaped translational trajectory, especially during up and down head turning. When the active user translates while the passive user turns their head in a similar direction, the matching of translational signals may confuse the passive user's brain, causing it to mistakenly perceive visual and vestibular signals as aligned and creating a sensation of translation. Some VR embodiment methods leverage this feature by controlling translation through head or torso rotation/tilt, which has been shown to effectively generate a convincing locomotion sensation. Moreover, the feedback from the majority of participants indicates that the primary determining factor for the acceptability of conditions or sub-locomotion is physiological comfort, followed by psychological comfort, presence, and finally, the locomotion sensation. This provides designers with a reference when designing co-locomotion scenarios. For various locomotion parameter combinations, we found that high-speed/low teleportation interval has the largest temporary experience gap in WS, FS, and TS. In WL, FL, and TL, the high-speed or low interval and high head-turning speed generally have the largest temporary experience gap, followed by high-speed or low interval and low head-turning speed. The speed or interval combinations with the largest temporary experiential gaps are easily understood because higher intensity visual stimuli can further increase the level of sensory conflict. Interestingly, high speed or small interval and low head-turning speed combinations often exhibit larger experiential gaps in certain metrics compared to low speed or large interval and high head-turning speed combinations, indicating that in co-locomotion, the locomotion parameters of active users play a greater role than those of passive users. For various combinations of susceptibility to motion sickness, not prone to dizziness and prone to dizziness has the largest experience gap in SSQ and presence scales, followed by prone to dizziness and prone to dizziness and not prone to dizziness with the smallest experience gap. As a known significant factor affecting motion sickness susceptibility not only significantly impacts motion sickness gaps, but also affects presence gaps significantly. These ranking results provide references for pairings/combinations of active and passive users under actual co-locomotion scenarios. In summary, according to our study, designers can understand the advantages and disadvantages of each co-locomotion condition, as well as the ranking of conditions. This insight helps determine which conditions can provide a better experience and can be directly applied to co-locomotion scenarios, and which conditions need further improvement to be effectively applied. Second, this research speculates on the various reasons for the experience gap, which helps reveal the complex relationship between perceived locomotion stimuli/conflicts and user experience in VR co-locomotion environments. As an aspect of the experience that is rarely explored in other studies, the significant temporary experience gap resulting from sub-locomotion combinations allows designers to identify sub-locomotion and their parameter combinations that can be confidently used in such scenarios, while intentionally avoiding or intervening in these sub-locomotion combinations when designing co-locomotion scenarios. My report is finished. Thank you for your watching.